Base Carbon had an exciting press release yesterday that we'll review in this video, and we'll go over the implications this news has on the company's future. But bear with me here, because before we go over that PR, we should go over the history of Base Carbon and the structure of the company so you can have a better understanding of what all this means. So, when Base Carbon was formed, much of the management team's experience was based around capital markets. For example, the CEO, Michael Costa's previous experience was as a portfolio manager at Goldman Sachs and other large financial firms, not in carbon markets. Now, this isn't to say that the company had no experience in the carbon sector, but it was an area that Base certainly needed help in. And this led to the partnership Base Carbon formed with Hardwick Climate Business Limited, or HCBL. The CEO of HCBL, Phil Hardwick, was made the COO of Base Carbon to lead carbon project royalty origination and operations. Other experts from HCBL were brought onto the team as well, and this brought significant carbon market experience to the company, along with the project pipeline that HCBL had established as well. The original plan for this was for Base and HCBL to fully merge in 3 phases. But in the meantime, HCBL and Base Carbon formed a subsidiary called Base Carbon Capital Partners Corp, or BCCPC, which they had joint ownership in. Because the two companies had completed 2 phases so far, Base Carbon owned around 78% of BCCPC, and HCBL owned 22%. This subsidiary is what holds all the carbon royalty investments. So HCBL was entitled to a decent percentage of the revenue beforehand. But overall, all of this was very accretive to Base Carbon, in my opinion, especially if they were actually able to close that merger. But unfortunately, that deal fell through because of market conditions worsening, and it was just going to be too dilutive for Base Carbon shareholders to integrate HCBL, so the partners decided against it. So this now creates a risk for Base because of the possibility of the company losing that carbon experience at some point, which is relatively rare to find in the voluntary carbon markets, as this space has only really been gaining traction over the last 5 years or so. And this leads us back to today's press release, because this has brought some much needed clarity for this company. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the complete merger with HCBL is not going to happen. At least not for the foreseeable future anyway. Instead, HCBL will be retained as consultants to Base Carbon on carbon project sourcing and advisory. HCBL will be paid a consulting fee of approximately $830,000, and they will receive up to a 3.5% fee per successful project based on the investment capital required for said project. So if Base Carbon needed to invest $10 million into a project to generate credits from their royalty, then HCBL would get $350,000. Now, because of this relationship, there are several new changes. The first being BCCPC, the subsidiary company that controls the royalties, is now 100% owned by Base Carbon. So now we are entitled to 100% of the revenues from any project. HCBL no longer has its 22% stake. Buying back HCBL shares of the subsidiary will cost approximately $1.6 million in cash. But all this doesn't mean that all the equity incentives for HCBL to stay involved are gone. Phil Hardwick's Base Carbon shares, approximately $2 million, are going to be held in escrow until 2024, and he has 500,000 Base Carbon options with a $1 Canadian strike price. Now, lastly, Base Carbon's also retaining a minority interest in HCBL, approximately 15% of the company. So there are still ties between both companies here. Not necessarily the end of the world right now. But this does pose a risk, as HCBL will not ultimately be integrated into Base Carbon. Now, the second portion of the press release about news with Verra is why the market's reacting so positively. Verra is the carbon credit verification body that oversees the cook stove methodology that Base Carbon's projects use. Now, one of the primary risks that Base was previously facing was the possibility that the verification of their projects would be delayed, because Verra had been quite backed up, which would have been a huge issue because Verra had recently released a new version of that cook stove methodology, with the deadline that all new projects had to be verified on that old methodology by June 28, 2023. And if projects weren't verified by then, at that point, then the new methodology would take over, and it would likely cause delays for Base, because they'll have to account for those new changes. Well, it was confirmed in this press release that Verra had completed their verification review of Base's Vietnam project, which is estimated to produce 45 million carbon credits over its 10-year lifespan. The original estimate of what that project would generate was around 26 million. So the estimate has doubled from what was originally included in BMO Capital Markets projections here. At which point the estimate was for Base Carbon to generate around 15 million from the Vietnam project in revenue. So we could see Base actually generate around 30 million in revenue from this project this year. But this estimate was done with an average carbon credit price of $10, which has probably dropped from there. But with that said, the first 7.4 million credits that this project generates are already marked for sale in an offtake agreement with Citigroup. So it's currently unknown what price these credits are going to sell for. But either way, this is a major catalyst and increase in revenue for a company that's pre-revenue right now. Deeply undervalued by net asset value, it'll cash flow positively this year and potentially even be profitable. Now, this is a major accomplishment because there's no other public carbon royalty company that can say that right now. So even in horrible market conditions for the voluntary carbon markets, Base Carbon is in a pretty good position, in my opinion. But yeah, that's going to be the end of the video here. If you'd like to learn more about Base Carbon, I'll link my introductory video and playlist on the company in the description of this video. And thanks for watching.